Act 2, interrogating John Philip Sousa about race. Sousa is virtually silent about all of the tumultuous events that occurred in the half century between 1875 and 1925. With regard to indigenous peoples, he can scarcely have been unaware of the relentless westward push with colossal loss of life of native tribes off their sacred lands. He surely knew of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in June of 1876, as America was celebrating its centennial by starting a final push against the last of the indigenous peoples. He surely knew of the massacre of hundreds of men, women, and children from the Lakota Sioux Nation at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. In marching along, Sousa speaks with great enthusiasm of a project launched by a request for his Marine Band in 1889 to play the national anthems of a number of countries represented by visiting dignitaries. Washington, October 18th, 1889. Special order. John Philip Sousa, the bandmaster of the Band of the United States Marine Corps, is hereby directed to compile, for the use of the department, the national and patriotic airs of all nations. B.F. Tracy, Secretary of the Navy. The work was issued in 1890 and is a standard all over the world. It remains the most exhaustive volume of its kind. In my collection, I included many songs of the American Indians with represented melodies of the following tribes: Apache, Cherokee, Chippewa, Dakota, Eskimo, Iowa, Iroquois, Ponca, Vancouver. The titles were usually descriptive: Apache Scalp Song and Dance, The Returning Hunter, etc. Many of these songs were sung to me by ethnologists and others who had traveled and lived among the Indians. I sat at my desk and applied harmonic treatment to the tunes without in any case changing a note of the melodies. It was, of course, ludicrous for Sousa to believe that by taking whatever songs were given or sung to him and then harmonizing them in Western style, the style belonging to the very people who were annihilating indigenous groups one after the other, that they would retain any of their original meaning or significance. Musically speaking, the Indian was annihilated yet again. Now, Sousa's biographers report that he was the honorary chief of 3 Indian nations, but I wonder how they would have felt about 2 numbers recorded in 1902 by Sousa's band in the midst of their 4 closely spaced European tours between 1900 and 1905. Neither of these numbers was slapped together. The arrangements are both elaborate and skillful, and the playing impeccable. First, we'll hear an Indian war dance. You'll hear every possible stereotype of the bloodthirsty savage reinforced in this 2.5-minute number. It's hard to think of a more effective tool of racial stereotyping. Now, by 1902, any organized resistance by indigenous groups had been brutally put down, so the event called Custer's Last Charge, that offered the excuse, by the way, for the final decimation by federal troops of Indian resistance, it could now be turned into a novelty item. None of the tragedy on either side, and certainly none of the aftermath. Now, you can say, and we can say, Sousa probably wasn't directly connected to either of these recordings, but he loaned his band with his name, and he knew that that was the strong selling point for the items that came out. It guaranteed a level of performance probably not matched by many other recordings. Now, we don't know specifically who made the stunning arrangements of either of these pieces, who rehearsed them, who conducted the recording. The assumption has always been that Sousa himself was never directly involved. I think that's probably not entirely true, but there's no way of proving it one way or the other. Sousa, of course, surely allowed the name of his band to be prominently featured on these recordings, as you can see here. Let's turn now to Sousa's views of the South. Sousa can hardly have been ignorant of the tragic consequences for Southern blacks of the withdrawal of Union troops starting in the 1870s. Washington, D.C., as he was fond of saying, lay south of the Mason-Dixon line. He must have known about the lost cause narrative dating back to 1866 that was formally embraced by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1894. They openly rewrote the history of the Civil War to make the South look like a victim of Northern aggression, bent on destroying a noble way of life accepted and appreciated by submissive blacks. They were largely responsible for the literally hundreds of statues of Confederate war heroes that sprung up all over the South between 1890 and 1930. Here is Sousa in his own words. At this time, plans were being made for commemorating the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. This declaration antedated the Philadelphia document by more than a year. That turns out not to be true, but let's go on. Senator Ransom of North Carolina called on President Harrison, asking him to attend the celebration and deliver a speech. But the president's engagements were such that he could not accept, so the Marine Band was sent to take part in the ceremonies, which were to be held for a week or more in Fayetteville, North Carolina. This is around 1889, probably. Sousa is still the director of the United States Marine Band. A committee of prominent citizens met us at the station and showed us to our quarters, a large hall well equipped as a barracks. The chairman of the committee said that he would call and discuss the programs with me after we had eaten. This was only 25 years after the War of the Rebellion, and just what a government band sent by a Republican president would play was a problem. I felt that this thought was uppermost in the chairman's mind when he requested such an interview. When he arrived, he asked what I intended for music at the ceremonies next day. Well, I began, we'll open with the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, he agreed. Then we will play the Coronation March from the opera of The Prophet by Giacomo Meyerbeer. We will follow with the overture from William Tell, On the Blue Danube, excerpts from Aida, and then My Country 'Tis of Thee. That is all very fine, he said soberly, but I should like to remind you that there's a tune down here that we love like mother's milk. I don't know whether your band plays it, but we surely would like to hear it. What is it? I asked in a most unconcerned and discouraging manner. It is called Dixie, he said. I know the tune. I'll think it over whether we can make use of it or not. You know, we are a very artistic organization and must always consider our programs very seriously. Yes, said my disturbed committeeman. But if you can tuck it in, I know the people would love it. Some of them haven't heard it since the surrender. Of course, I was only teasing the poor fellow. A musician who went south in those days without Dixie in his repertoire was mentally, morally, and physically damned by everybody, and doubtless should have been. Next morning, the ceremonies began. The town overflowed. People had come in from the mountains and the plains, from the forests and the fields. They bunked in covered wagons, and I saw boys asleep in dry goods boxes, under stoops and on benches. Governor Fowle made the first speech. As he finished his address, I summoned my men to their feet, and we played the national anthem, which was very quietly received. The next speaker was the chairman, who made a short speech introducing Senator Vance, the idol of the state. As the chairman sat down, just before Senator Vance rose to deliver his speech, I signaled to the band, and we launched into Dixie. It was like an electric shock. A rebel yell starting on the grandstand went booming down the street through the surging crowds. Never was there so tremendous and thrilling a shout. The very air seemed to quiver with excitement. A myriad hats went rocketing upwards. Grim old warriors cried aloud. The women turned and hugged each other, and for 15 minutes pandemonium reigned. After that, in fact, during the entire time we were in Fayetteville, our programs ran something like this. Overture, William Tell. Song, Dixie. Waltz, Blue Danube, song Dixie. Airs from Faust, song Dixie. Medley, favorite tunes, song Dixie. And the encore to every one of these numbers was Dixie. Well, I think you get an idea that Sousa not only did not object to Dixie, but was happy to comply at every turn with his Southern hosts. He had surely drunk the Kool-Aid.